If I started the conversation with, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put cameras in every classroom and we're going to feed it to AI. I probably wouldn't even get through that sentence before being thrown out. If I lead with, let me show you the kind of insights that we can gather about your teachers, your learners, then the first question out of those folks is, how do we do that?
Hi, and welcome to It's Not the End of the World, Everyday Use Cases for AI. My name is Bobby McClousich, and I'm the head of AI integration here at Quite Frankly Productions in New York City. I'm the creative director, and I'm also a former teacher. Now, one of my remits in my teaching profession was to use technology to enhance education, and I was in charge of bringing other faculty members on board with new technologies. So I'm particularly excited about my guest today because he is literally at the forefront of that very, what would you say, intersection of technology and education. His credentials are wide-ranging, having studied at some of the most prestigious universities in America, namely Harvard and Columbia. And so, without further ado, let me introduce you to Luyen Chou. Luyen, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Was that introduction accurate? Did I kind of give you?
Got it. I think you nailed it.
All right. Well, maybe you can kind of give us a bit more of how you would frame your background and where you reside now in the world.
Yeah. Well, so I began my professional career as a teacher. So we have that in common. But going back to, the early 90s, I started as a teacher in 1989. And it's been almost an accidental journey because I never thought I would be a teacher. It was kind of a quick stop on the way to other things, but fell in love with teaching and learning and education and classrooms and students. But I was also really, always have been kind of a frontier technologist, got very interested in how we could combine technology and education. And then over the years have, one of the things I've been very mindful of is that education evolves at a very slow rate in comparison to other industries. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but you see incredible pockets of innovation in classrooms, but they really struggle to scale. And so one of the things I got very interested in was the concept of product development and products, because products are the way that we scale innovation in a free market economy. And I thought very early about how could we apply that kind of concept to educational innovation. And so I've really lived my career, my working life at the intersection of education, technology, and product mindset. So that's sort of how I would characterize who I am and what I do.
Okay, the intersection of product, education, and technology. Okay, so that's obviously quite conceptual. So bring it into kind of, bricks and mortar.
I am the CEO of a company called Dewey Learn, DEWEYLEARN. And Dewey Learn Dewey Learn is named after John Dewey. He wrote a seminal book called Democracy and Education. Frankly, has never been more relevant actually than today, given a larger cultural and societal trends. And if you go to ed school now, the first book you read is Democracy and Education. And so I named the company after Dewey, but it's also a pun, Dewey Learn. But there's also a more personal connection, which is that in 1923, John Dewey, starting the first education program at University of Chicago, and his wife got fascinated by China and Chinese history, and they actually traveled to China in 1923. I mean, unheard of for an American to travel to China to identify promising young women from rural parts of China to study this new field called education at the University of Chicago. And one of the lucky young women that they identified was my grandmother. And she came to the States to study with John Dewey at the University of Chicago. And so John Dewey is literally the reason I am in the United States and I'm doing what I'm doing today. So that's the origin story behind the name Dewey Learn. And I know you weren't asking about that, but I thought important to connect the dots on the name and the personal story.
No, it's a beautiful human kind of story, and you've almost got quite a spiritual connection to education. I mean, it's really the bedrock of your personality and who you are. So am I understanding then that Dewey Learn it's about trying to find new ways to educate people? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah. So the thing that we set out to do. So my partner Dirk Liebisch, who's a brilliant ML AI CTO, has been in the AI space for a long time.
I'm gonna just
Thing that he and I
I'm just gonna use those expand those terms. So machine
sure.
learning.
Machine learning, artificial intelligence. He comes from the business intelligence, financial services sector, using early versions of AI and now more advanced versions of AI to do predictive analytics. I've always been interested in how do you take that kind of set of capabilities that we use in the financial services sector and apply it to learning. How can we make learning more efficient? How can we drive better outcomes through the sorts of tools that we use in financial systems to drive financial outcomes? When we started working together, we started to see the tsunami of the large language model and the transformer approach, the explosion of power of neural networks. And this is even before the fall of 2022 with the launch of ChatGPT. We could see the tidal wave coming,
Okay,
and for me, like,
when did you guys start working together?
we started working together probably around 2020, and then more earnestly in 21, 22.
Right.
And
You
what
could
we
see
got
that
very
you could see that becoming because you guys were tapped into the computer science space.
yeah.
How did you come to be aware that there was this tsunami on the horizon?
Yeah. So, look, I'd been working in AI and some form of AI since I was a high school senior in 1985. Um, and like a lot of people, I kind of gave up on it because we just it felt like running through mud. We could not achieve what we wanted to achieve. And it just felt like it was a dead end. It was an endless slog, and we'd hit a ceiling, and we had to find new approaches. And I think, I lost the thread of the argument for a while. People like Dirk didn't. They stuck with it. And I think
Dirk is your business partner.
Dirk's my business partner,
Yeah.
Dirk Liebisch. I think what happened is you see this incredible intersection of the advances in pure computing power, right? So the Moore's law phenomenon that we have this doubling every 2 years of just raw computer capacity with the birth of the internet and the digitization of all human knowledge. Now you have a training database that this incredibly highly capable technology can feed on. And then you have new algorithmic techniques. So like the transformer. So most people don't know that the GPT is generalized pre-trained transformers, right? The T is transformer. And a transformer technology was this idea of, it started with companies like Google. Google invented this, trying to, do a better job at autocomplete, right? Or how do I predict the next word? And what they realize is to predict the next word in a sentence actually requires a contextual understanding far beyond the sentence, because the next word that I'm using here with you is informed by the whole conversation that we've had. And so this notion of how can we actually create long-term context to inform next word prediction turned into a breakthrough in the way we think about neural networks. And, this is geeky stuff. So only people like Dirk or me are like looking at this back in 2019, 2020, and we could see, we knew right away because of all of the failures that we had encountered in the past, like this is the unlock. This is going to change everything. And so it was kind of a drop everything moment. And then even getting past that, even back in 2022, 21, 22, both Dirk and I realized that the short term, the early stage of large language model interaction and our human interaction with AI would be text-based. But really, like, we're here doing a podcast where I'm not texting you my responses. You're not texting me the questions, because as humans, looking into each other's eyes, seeing you nod as I'm speaking, listening to the tone of my voice is as important, if not more important, than the semantic context of what I'm saying. And so what Dirk and I got very excited about in the educational context was what we call multimodal AI. What happens when an AI is not just responding to a text message? What happens when AI has access to the fully multimodal real-time context of an exchange between a learner and a teacher, or between two learners, or any two human beings? And the very practical problem we set out to solve was in schools today, in many schools, and as a teacher, you probably are familiar with this, the kind of gold standard of assessing and evaluating and measuring teacher effectiveness is not a standardized test. It's having a skilled master teacher come in and observe your class. And if you go back even to the early 2000s with the Gates Foundation and Harvard having done this study on the measures of effective teaching, what they proved was that what the most accurate predictor of teachers' success is not the number of degrees they have after their name, the number of years of service, where they came from, what language they speak. It was how other teachers observe their practice, their ability to,
How other teachers observed their
yeah,
practice. Wait,
the score that a master teacher gave to them when they walked into their classroom and they graded their class. Right.
okay.
It was human feedback on how good you were, Bobby, as a teacher through a structured lens, right? And it would be things like, do kids raise their hands? Do they look engaged? Are they focused? Are they paying attention? Do they nod in affirmation because they understood what the teacher was talking about? That if you could measure those things, you knew whether a teacher was delivering learning effectively.
Right. Right. Are you saying, just to clarify your point, are you saying that that would be a predictor of whether the teacher would be a good teacher
Yes. It
in
would be
terms of,
both a measure of high quality teaching and more so even a predictor of student success. If you had a high quality teacher who taught high quality, delivered high quality instruction, that was a better predictor of student success than almost any other measure out there. The problem is you can't scale it. It's just too expensive, and there are too few educators who can provide that kind of observational feedback. So the first
wait,
test we gave ourselves, yeah,
but also, sorry to keep interrupting, but
yeah, no, that's right.
also if the master educator who goes into the lesson and observes that lesson, it sounds like there's also, you said it's not possible to scale that. So it sounds like there's also a benefit to the person being observed, that they will improve their
Absolutely.
teaching, their
Yeah,
pedagogical practice as a
that's right.
result of being observed. Is that what you're
You
sort
got it.
of
Yeah.
insinuating? Okay. But
Yeah, I mean,
the
that's
problem is scale, but the problem with scale is that there's not enough master
it's
teachers to go
twofold.
around.
But yeah, exactly, exactly. It's not enough observers and coaches, but there also aren't enough skilled teachers. And what we found is the fastest way to scale the teacher's capability is through reflection on their practice. And you get that in through these observations. So if you could unlock that, you can create a force multiplier in classrooms. But how are you going to do that? It's a catch-22. We don't have enough good teachers to become great coaches to then go coach the teachers, right? What if multimodal AI could do that?
Interesting.
What if you could
Okay.
put a camera in a classroom and it would give feedback on what was going that was better than what a master human educator observer could provide to a teacher?
Okay. Well, good question. Good rhetorical question. Well, what if? Well, let me ask you that question then. Well, first, what if? And second, but more importantly, how?
Yeah,
How can you do that?
yeah,
Okay, and let me just, by the skeptic's mind, let me voice those concerns. Well, the master teacher is a human being, and they're going in and they're saying, they have the years of experience, and they're able to from their years of experience, they're able to impart their wisdom onto this naive teacher that is doing their best in the classroom, and through their sensitivities and empathy, they're able to extract the best qualities of this naive teacher. So how can we augment that with AI?
yeah. So, that was a study question that we set out to answer. We didn't know what the answer was, what it could do. And I'll get to the how, but let me start with what happened, which is, we dropped a couple cameras into classrooms. We created this thing called Dewey Learn that extracted the features from the video that were important to educators. And I was the trainer, right? I told Dewey Learn how I would observe a class, and we were just blown away by the quality, blown away. And as someone who's probably observed, and done evaluations of hundreds of classrooms, it was far better and more consistent and more detail oriented than I ever was. That was a hard thing to admit, but it was true. And to your point about the how, this is part of the secret sauce of Dewey Learn, but it really is, we've created a system that can learn from master educators. What do you look for? How do you measure? What kinds of metrics do you use? What are your look fors in the classroom? And Dewey Learn is able to create its own approach and its own, what we call framework, based on those conversations with educators, and then apply it to the video with great consistency and accuracy.
Okay. All right. So let me synthesize this and put this into my own words. So much like how the GPT models, the large language models, would take corpuses of text and then predict the next word, and in order to do that, would need to understand what makes a sentence or a paragraph or a piece of writing sing. So too does Dewey Learn. It is able to take its training on what a good lesson looks like, what good teaching looks like, and then through machine learning, reinforcement learning, I imagine, is that what's happening here? It's then able to add 2 and 2 together and get the correct answer. So it looks at the video is placed in the room, and it observes the lesson. It has seen a gazillion lessons before, and an expert has said, this is what a good lesson looks like, tick,
Yep.
tick, tick. And
Yep.
it's able to say, okay, I know what a good lesson looks like, and I'm watching a good lesson now. Is that kind
Right.
of essentially what was happening?
You got it. Yep.
Right. Okay. Now, so as a former teacher, one of the most stressful experiences for a teacher is when they're about to be observed, right? So, I'm like, I know that in England, I don't know if you're familiar with Ofsted. You worked for Pearson,
Yeah.
which is obviously an exam board that provided examinations for, certainly in England. I don't know if in America, is
Yeah.
Pearson in
Yeah.
America too?
Similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our listeners will know who Pearson are. Yeah. When Ofsted's coming in, that's the again for the listeners, Ofsted is the government's examination board that would come in, and examiners would go into your classroom, and that week was the most stressful week of a teacher's life, because they are making sure all of the books are marked, and
Yeah.
you're making sure
That's
all of the
right.
kids know
Yeah.
what levels they're working at, and you're trying to make sure that every one of your lessons is an outstanding lesson, because God forbid it's not an outstanding lesson, and the school's reputation resides on whether or not you manage to deliver that outstanding lesson. I went through 2 Ofsted processes during my career, and sure enough, they were extremely stressful experiences. I will just take the opportunity to say I did get an outstanding rating for what it's worth. I just want to get that on record. But it was painful, and I could imagine teachers and teachers' unions even being somewhat resistant to a camera being placed in every classroom, because Lord knows we can't be outstanding, 100% of the time. We're already teaching 5 lessons a day, and we're already overworked, and there's already so much admin, and I need to just have one lesson where I let the kids watch, you know, the Avengers and list every noun that they see and every adjective, and so I could mark my 16-year-old, coursework. So, yeah, how do you respond to that? I know that's maybe a little bit of a
Yeah.
kind of a,
Yeah. I think actually this is the perfect solution to that, because can be implemented in a non-high stakes way. If we really wanted to help teachers, we would put that observer in their classroom all 200 days of school and provide them the feedback. We can't do it. So what happens? They only go in 3 times, and it's a high stakes activity, right? Just like high stakes testing of students. What you really want to do is you want to be assessing them constantly through their learning, and not have 3 exams that determine the fate of their future. So, the use cases that we use Dewey Learn, a teacher can have it on all the time and never show anyone the feedback. They can ask the most vulnerable question to Dewey Learn, because it's a chatbot. about how they could have done something differently or better, or another way to do something. And then from an accountability standpoint, my vision, and we haven't quite implemented this with our partners, but instead of having, you know, Luyen come into Bobby's classroom, it happens to be the day that Bobby was having a family emergency at home. The kids in his classroom didn't eat the night before, and the observer Luyen it was in a bad mood. Why don't I have the teacher say, I've been using Dewey Learn all semester long. I'm going to pick the 3 videos and my conversations with Dewey Learn that I would like to be representative of my practice, and sit down with the observer and actually have a conversation with Dewey Learn with the video and talk about what actually happened. And so actually what we find is that it takes a lot of the stress and the burden off of these high stakes, very few, like moments in time where you have to perform, and makes it just more part of the warp and the woof of what a teacher does.
Okay. So you're seeing it more as like a teaching assistant that isn't necessarily like the headmaster of the school isn't
Right.
observing every class, but in your ideal world, while that might be happening, in your ideal world, this is actually the teacher's tool
Yeah.
that
I think
they are
that's right.
using to get real-time
Yeah.
feedback
Yeah.
from this expert in teaching, this well-trained expert. And I can see how that would be valuable, because one of the ways that I use ChatGPT, or all of my other large language models, subscribe to all of them at this point, but one of the ways I use them is for reassurance, and more than ever I noticed that the therapeutic benefit of using
Hmm.
these large language models is to, rather than necessarily get an answer to anything, it's more just to get reassurance that what I'm thinking isn't necessarily stupid, and I can just keep moving in this direction,
Yep.
whatever that might be.
Yep.
I won't share all of my insecurities in this life, but there are enough of them that I'm able to talk to a large language model about an insecurity. I've started to realize, oh, what I needed was just a pat on the back and say, "You're doing all right. This is fine. Keep going."
Yep.
And when I was a teacher, one of the biggest sources of anxiety was, am I doing my job well enough? Am I serving these kids well enough? And there weren't enough hours in the day. It was a real, the weight, the burden of responsibility when you're a teacher, certainly in the early years, is that I don't have enough time to mark all of these kids' work and plan all of these lessons, and I want to do the best lessons possible. I've been told in my training that a good lesson looks like A, B, and C, and so I have to deliver my lesson in that way. And I could imagine being able to talk to an AI that says, Bobby, you're doing a good job and it's good enough. You can have the kids sit down and read for 20 minutes, half an hour in the lesson while you are preparing something else. And not only that, but all of the other teachers in your school are doing the same thing.
Yep.
So don't beat yourself up if you're not
Yep.
doing a super interactive lesson every
Yep.
time you see this class.
Yep.
I
And,
could
and by
imagine
the
that being
way,
extremely helpful.
yeah, and by the way, you may not have noticed, Bobby, that Luyen asks a meaningful question in every class. His hand is up. For the last 3 classes, he hasn't raised his hand. You might want to ask him why, right? So being that extra pair of eyes and ears in a classroom, super valuable. We built a version of Dewey Learn now that is a Zoom, Teams, Google Meet plugin, because a lot of the use cases now are online learning. Imagine that you plugged Dewey, you invited Dewey Learn the way you could a Fathom or an Otter, but it's seeing and hearing, not just transcribing, to what we're doing right now. And you had a companion in Dewey Learn that could tell you, Bobby, you're doing a great job as a podcaster. Here are examples of things that really drew a question or something deep out of your guest. And I've watched all your guests. This is the thing you do that most gets to the core of what they're about. This is why your audiences are. Dewey Learn can do all of that, right? It's watching the expression of your interviewee, the voice tonality, the content. It becomes your companion in understanding. I like to think we've moved beyond a sort of classroom technology. I really think that Dewey Learn's superpower is helping humans understand human understanding, is the way I would put it.
Interesting. Is that you feel like that's the real mission at the heart of this? Yeah, helping humans understand humans. Interesting. All right, I've got two kind of like routes I want to go down. I guess the first one, again, is all these sort of logistical questions, which is where my mind goes because obviously, I've been integrated in that space,
Sure.
in the education space for a long time. Well, it was for a long time. And one of the issues was always compliance. I know this is like very logistical or get into the weeds, but I'm like, how you said you've got a few partners that you work with, and in England, having a camera in the classroom was very I couldn't have filmed my kids, for example. Let's say I was a vlogger. I remember back in the day, obviously vlogging was some sort of piece of my destiny. And here I am now doing a podcast. I remember back when I was a teacher thinking about like, I was experimenting with new techniques. I was experimenting with behavioral management techniques. And at the time I was like, oh, I would love to do a blog about this. Maybe I'd like to film something and just show how I'm doing this thing in the classroom. But there would have been no way, right? Like all of the kids' identities were sacrosanct, and even to film a kid at, say, or at sports day to share with their parents would have been something that just either you needed a ton of permissions or for more of the parents and so on. It was just a bit of a nightmare. I'm wondering, how does that kind of work with you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all navigating this as a society. We have actually had fewer issues than I would have imagined. And we're working with major charter school programs, with teacher education programs. I think, and we're, you know, there's a lot going on in this space, right? So most US school districts and municipalities and states have their own data privacy agreements, and particularly when it deals with students and minors. And a lot of practitioners in this domain, and whether it's a school district or a state, they now have data privacy agreements that they require their vendors to sign. But so far, we've been able to comply with all of those. I think the what I have found is these sort of data privacy agreements and norms and standards, which I actually believe in. I think we need to protect ourselves. I think government has a role in making sure these technologies are being used in a way that doesn't compromise our safety. But what I find is it's not a single-sided equation. It's a cost benefit analysis. And so when I go into a district or I talk to an educational partner, I don't start with, if I started the conversation with, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put cameras in every classroom and we're going to feed it to AI. I probably wouldn't even get through that sentence before being thrown out. If I lead with, let me show you the kind of insights that we can gather about your teachers, your learners, then the first question out of those folks is, how do we do that? And it totally changes the conversation. And now they are actually working with us to figure out what is the compliance needed in order to be able to do it. And there are a lot of more tactical things we do. So we mask names, identities of students. We don't take the student information system data in. We don't tie it to a student record. We can blur faces when necessary. We adhere to the most rigorous standards of, information security and data storage and data retention.
Is
So,
the recordings like saved? Is the teacher able to watch back, or is it more that it's just like the AI has watched it and has
yeah.
a memory of what happened, and then I
So
can talk to it?
we can do it either way. The system works perfectly well if it analyzes a video and then never sees the videos, deleted, or the customer keeps the video and we have no access to it. You get a better experience if the video is available, because you can go from the insight back to the video, right? If it says at minute 15:34, the students seemed disengaged, they were all looking down at their toes, being able to click and see that part of the video is useful, but it's not required.
Sounds like an incredible piece of technology. So, how is it developing it?
Uh, Incredible. I mean, so, I've been an entrepreneur for 35 years and I've built multiple companies, and I have never experienced the velocity that we experience now, because I often say this to people, like, we have 8 human employees in the company now, and we have something like 12 AI employees. All the software development, the coding, is being done by AI agents now. And the system is improving itself much faster than we could as humans improve it.
Okay, when did you found Dewey Learn?
Uh, so we founded it in the spring of 2024,
Wow.
and we raised our first seed round in almost just about a year ago, in February of 25.
24, did you say spring 24? So April 24
Yep.
through to February 25.
Yep.
How did you, to get that seed, you had to have a prototype? Did you have to have a prototype?
We had a
How did,
working pilot. We were piloting with customers by
right,
then.
okay. So how did you get that first piece of technology that was ready to be deployed into the classroom up and running?
Dirk doing his magic and me acting as product manager, and a lot of it, even back then, we were using Agentic AI to build these tools, really, really fast. And you can scale these things incredibly fast now. And we have a very lean, agile mantra. Let's build just good enough to deploy and experiment and get it into the hands of customers.
Okay, I'm going to pivot now into this more like practical part of the podcast now, which is, yeah, I want to hear about this kind of day-to-day building and how that all works. So you were a product manager and you were able to start building. Were you building it yourself? Did you have some devs that you worked with?
We were building it ourselves. It was mostly Dirk. Then we hired one other developer, but very early on, we were using, you know, we were agentically coding. We were using, kind of the predecessor to OpenAI Codex and predecessor to Claude Code.
Okay, tell me about that relationship. So Claude Code is obviously the sort of darling of the moment, and Codex. Meanwhile, what's the difference between Codex and Claude Code? Why were you using them both?
Well, it's just we'll use whatever is the best of breed, and these guys are all leapfrogging each other, right? So it's really more of that than anything else. I mean, originally, um, uh, ChatGPT or GPT, and originally we were using even things like Cursor, just produced really good code, fast. And there were a lot of issues, and you really had to bird dog it and manage. And there were a lot of techniques to get it to work right. It has very bad memory, all sorts of things like that. And then when Claude Code launched, it was way better than anything else, and better than GPT. And so we kind of switched over to Claude Code, and then Claude. Really, the next step is it's one thing to have one agent helping you to code. Um, and then you want it to be even more capable as an agent. So you don't want to have to go and set up the GitHub repo and deploy stuff, to the web. You want the agent to be able to do all of that. So that got more and more capable. And then I think what started to happen was people started to realize, like, I don't just want one agentic coder. I want multiple agentic coders because I want one really focusing on the front end of our system. I want one focused on the data stack. I want one focused on the AI analysis, and then actually I don't just want one. I want three for every one of those, because I want them to jury their results so that by the result I get is actually what three agentic programmers decided was the best thing. So then you start to see the emergence of these agentic coding frameworks. You need some sort of harness, some sort of air traffic control to manage these multiple agents. And originally, Dirk, my partner, wrote our own kind of agent framework to manage that. And then Claude Code built their API, their SDK API stack, and that helped to manage things. And now, Codex, the new version of Codex from OpenAI, is exactly that. It's really a management framework for multiple agentic coding sort of programs, but it manages them, like air traffic control. And the human job, like our jobs, Dirk job, my job, our senior developer Boyan, they're almost like code managers. They're like dev managers. They're looking at the code that the agents bring to them, and they're validating them and a lot, sort of enabling them to check in that code or rejecting the code. And so they're kind of acting as the maintainers rather than as the coders.
Okay. So, all right. That's a very interesting insight into just what it is to build a product from the ground up in this new space. I've also experimented with vibe coding. We're developing apps here at our business to just streamline workflows. And yeah, it's been kind of amazing and eye-opening. My apps are very simple. It sounds like what you're creating is something quite complicated. I'm wanting you to elaborate on that shortly, because what I'm imagining, there's a camera in a classroom that is feeding into some sort of AI model that then the teacher needs to, or the user needs to be able to interact
Right.
with whatever has been put into it. So then there needs to be an interface for the teacher to kind of interact with. I mean, that's just at the basic level, and I imagine that there's other sort of management and UI requirements. So help me understand this app. Help me understand what you've built, I guess,
Yeah, sure.
if you don't mind.
So at a high level, what we do is we take an input, call it a video of a classroom or any kind of learning. We have multiple models that so we want to basically decompose that video into features that are relevant for an educator, right? So if you take a typical video, like if you think about how computer vision works, right? So computer vision processing of a video, it's taking every one of 24 frames per second in whatever 1080p, right, pixels, and it is extracting every feature from each frame. So you can imagine how massively compute and storage intensive that is. But on top of that, a just out of the box computer vision model doesn't know that actually in an educational setting, saying, that's the teacher, that's the student. The student's raising his hand is more important than, there's a plastic fern in back of this person, right? So the first step is we create a framework, a kind of like a fine-tuning framework for, even though we use an off-the-shelf vision model, we enhance it to say, here are the sorts of things you need to be paying attention to. Here are the things you should not pay attention to. I liken it, it's a little bit like, not to get too geeky, but it's kind of like a compression algorithm. Like if you think about, MPEG or, video compression, what it's doing is saying, between these two frames, what's the important information to maintain, right? And so that's what we're doing, but through the lens of learning.
So
So
you building that algorithm yourself? You haven't used like a foundational model, like an API from.
No, we do. So we use a foundational model for the pure vision processing. We don't build our own vision model, but we have grafted onto it this additional intelligence of use your powers to extract these sorts of things. Okay. And then we do the same thing with what we call prosody. So speech tonality. Here are the things to listen for. Here are the things to extract. And then we do the same thing with the semantic processing, right? So now you have semantics, vision, prosody.
Wait, define semantic processing
So
for me.
semantic is just the content, the linguistic content. If we had a transcript of our podcast here, that's the semantic content, right? If you have an audio tape and you're listening to me get excited about something, that's the prosodic layer, what we call prosody. And then the visual is me raising my hands like this, smiling to you, right?
Sure. And is it
So
the same? And is the same AI model that you use for the base of each of
there are
those? Or
3 different for each of those. So
can you
we're
name
using
them?
like 7 different models.
Wow.
And then we're grafting this intelligence into each of those to extract the features that are meaningful and important for our
Okay.
application. And then that extraction ends up getting stored in what we call a RAG. A RAG is effectively, think of it as an underlying database for an AI model to query, right? And it has these visual, prosodic, semantic components in it. So now if you put ChatGPT on top of that and you say, hey, were students engaged? It can go in and say, well, I understand student engagement means students are, the look for are students looking forward? Are their eyes on the teacher? Are their hands raised? Are they asking questions? Now it can extract that insight based on this incredibly synthesized database that we've created.
Right. So, all right, let me just let me just describe that pyramid that you've just described. At the base of the pyramid, there are multiple different models that specialize in the different disciplines, whether it's a visual model, an audio model, or I guess you called it, did you say
Semantic.
prosaic?
Yeah,
Semantic. So that's
prosody. Prosody. Yeah, prosody and semantics.
right. So that's the language. So those, you've got several models and maybe more besides in this kind of
Hmm.
at the base here. Then you've built on top of that. You described it as your own intelligence, but it sounds like you've coded things to help digest what those models have picked out. So look at the student raising his hand in the air. Don't look at the fern in the
Right.
background.
What do you pay attention to? It's all about attention.
Right. And then and then that all gets distilled into the next layer, which is, let's just say, ChatGPT, a traditional large language model that the user can interact with the large language model
Right.
that digests all of the information from below in the lower tiers of the pyramid. So my question to you is, did you vibe code your own intelligence? Was it just a case of just prompting, let's just say Claude Code for the sake of argument, like we need to tell our foundational models to look out for the kid putting his hand in the air and not the fern? Can you write that into whichever
Right.
script you need to write that into? Is that
Yeah,
what you
it's a
did?
little more complex than that in
Okay.
that the coding is done by the machines, but we have, Dirk and his team kind of saying like, hey, we want to take this architectural approach. The research says we should take this approach to extracting these features. We want to architect it this way. And then they're using AI to build the building blocks, the components of that, but it's guided by an architecture that they have defined.
It's the power of these tools in people that know how to use them,
That's right.
isn't it? Is
That's
basically
right.
what I'm
You
here
got
is
it.
what I'm hearing here. I
Yep.
can't walk in and just start building this
Yep.
thing that you've described because I don't have a development
Yep.
background. But if you're a
Right.
computer scientist or a developer, you're supercharged, which, it's just spreads across all industries. I mean, in video production, there's this moment of, oh my God, you can now generate a video in, VO3 or Midjourney or whatever your choice is. But as the kind of the dust is starting to settle, you realize these tools are very powerful in the hands of people that know how to use them, and the professionals are the people that know how to use them, and they can use them very, very effectively. Meanwhile, those that aren't professionals can produce maybe cool stuff, but just not as cool stuff.
You got
And
it.
I'm finding that in my own development adventures. I can build this application at work that's actually very simple and it's great, and people can use it. But I'm constantly thinking to myself, I wonder what the people that really know what they're doing are going to be able to do. And it sounds to me like one example is they're going to be able to build an eye in the sky in a classroom that can act as an
Yeah, you got
omnipotent
it.
observer of a lesson and then
Yep.
give
Yep.
extraordinary feedback to the person
Yep.
delivering that lesson. That's basically what I'm
Yep.
hearing here.
Yep. Yeah, you got it. That's exactly right. And I think what it points at is, boy, is there still room for human expertise. Human expertise is the force multiplier to a set of tools that are highly democratized, but can be used very poorly as well as effectively. That human vision, insight, expertise, knowledge is what actually is it. It's the opposite of what we thought. It's not that the vibe coding is a force multiplier for humans. It's the humans are the force multiplier for these agentic capabilities now.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're sort of speaking to the existential dread that everybody experiences when they talk about this technology taking jobs and all the rest of it. But yeah, I take your point and I want to expand on that because yeah, obviously these tools don't exist without the humans in the first place, and everything that they are doing is a reflection of the humans that A, built it, and B, want to use it in order to do more things. These tools have no motivation on their own, and they're not going to just start, taking jobs for the sake of it. They are working for somebody,
Right.
and
Right.
in a utopian vision, all of us can have all of our wildest dreams and imaginations realized because now I have an idea and I can execute it with my super intelligent friend that has been trained on all of the previous people that came before me and all of their knowledge and information. Again, it's a reflection of the humans, not some alien kind of
Yep.
unique thing that does
Yeah, you
and
got
came
it.
out of nowhere. Well, Leanne, I feel like we're starting to come towards the end of our time, but this has been a really, really fantastic exploration of this topic. I've really enjoyed the conversation. But before we go, we are going to move to the most what's the word? Exciting part of the podcast. The fun bit is a fan favorite part of the podcast. We are swimming in fans at this point, at least double figures.
How many are
So,
AIs?
there's a few. There might be a few bots in the mix. There's a few bots. On
Any malt? Yeah, I
Maltberg.
was gonna say any malt bots in there.
On Maltberg is huge. It's blowing up.
Yeah, that's a podcast unto itself.
But the quick tips section of the podcast is what I'm trying to get at. So, I mean, you've kind of, been delving into superpowers related to agentic coding for sure. But now this is the bit that I want, viewers just tuned into one bit and they wanted to get some practical kind of takeaways for themselves. This is what this bit's all about. So
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you 3 questions. One for a general tip, just like a general, everybody could use it for this or try using this or this functionality or whatever it might be. And when I say this, I'm largely kind of revolving around large language models. The second tip I'm going to ask you for is your own personal superpower or hack. And then third, a surprising or unexpected use case. But you know what? Before we get onto those 3 things, because there's another sort of piece of this puzzle that I always like to look at just before we get to this kind of to finish. I want to finish on an optimistic note, but I also am curious to know whether you have any misgivings about the
Mm,
shape of things, and if is there
yeah.
anything here that any watch outs, any concerns, anything about you're talking about a very optimistic vision for how Dewey Learn could help in the classroom. But are there any like kind of pitfalls or mines or tripwires that you're trying to navigate your way around?
Yeah.
I guess I'm speaking to the realist in you, the perhaps the p- you
No,
know,
I worry about this a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot of concerns. I think, for one, I think there's a world in which these agentic AIs are a huge threat to the profession of teaching. I get questions all the time about, do we really need teachers? Can we just have agents as teachers? And I'm a firm believer that humans teaching humans is like a fundamental value. It's not optional, but that's one view, and other people have different views. And how, for those of us who believe in the primacy of human to human interaction, how do we carve space for that? And so part of the urgency I have around Dewey Learn is how can we make human teachers better, faster, and in a more human way, so they're not outstripped by the agents. And so I worry about that. I think another big area of concern I have is, what are the durable skills? What should we be teaching? In a world where ChatGPT can ace every single academic exam that we could give a human student, including graduate level students, including now 40% proficiency on humanity's last exam, which Scale AI built as the last bulwark of defense of humanity versus computers. And in the first less than 12 months, computers can already beat it at 40%. What are the durable skills that we need to be thinking about? And they're probably not things like reading, writing, and arithmetic and factual recall. They're probably things like empathy and creativity and collaboration and storytelling, and ethics. So how do I think we need to really radically rethink what the value proposition is of our formal educational institutions. And that is both hopeful and worrisome, because, I think it's hopeful because I think we have incredible opportunity to raise the ceiling of value for education. It's worrisome because educators are, sadly, and I will include myself in it, the most resistant to change and evolution. And what do we do about that? How do we accelerate change in education is something I worry about. And, I also think, I worry tremendously about what as an educator, about what I now call truth decay, and not tooth decay, but truth decay, which is the erosion of factual truth, our ability to know what's real. And this is a trend that started pre-AI, with sort of moral equivalency in the political sphere. And now we're in a world where everyone can see a news headline and not actually know if it's true or not, and take their own meaning out of it. And how do we navigate that as educators, and just more broadly as citizens of civil society? I'm really deeply concerned about all of that.
yeah. Well, you started this conversation as saying something about the slow pace at which education space has evolved. and that was something that struck you. And it does seem like we're on the kind of verge of education having to wrestle with that very, very quickly. I'm hearing that in some of the more prestigious universities, they're starting to administer their exams orally
Yeah.
rather than in any type of written
Yeah.
capacity, which seems like a one smart building block in this future. And I happen to be quite optimistic about the teaching profession. I can see how Dewey Learn is a adaptable technology that no matter which direction teaching goes in, whether that is teachers using traditional methods of standing at the front of the classroom and trying to engage 30 kids, or whether because every human being who's been put out of work is now funneled towards
Right.
human to human
Yep.
based jobs,
Yep.
of which I see teaching as being one of them. I think we will all want our children to be raised by humans. You can imagine that Do We Learn would be very useful in helping that new influx of humans into the profession to learn how to administer or convey these new skills which
Yep.
we have to teach.
Yep.
Now, what are those skills still
Yep.
remains to be seen. I
Yep.
feel fairly confident now that those skills are, human to human life skills, empathy,
Yep.
etc. I even
Yep.
think I believe there's an NPR article episode. There was an interview with where they were talking about those coming out of economics education, the economics courses in universities. I'm butchering this, but the economics courses are now repivoting less towards the kind of data science and
Yep.
more towards modules on people management, because
Yeah.
that is going to be the skill of big business in the future.
Yep.
And so
Totally agree.
I think all of that feels like what the kind of the landscape is going to look like. And I, for one, am super excited about
Yeah, me too.
the impact that AI is going to have on
Yep.
education, because
Yep.
teachers have for too long been overworked and the class sizes have been getting bigger and bigger and the students more and more disengaged. And I just see this sort of bright shining light of potential to differentiate lessons so that every kid gets their own personalized education, and the teacher can kind of focus on making sure that the lessons are engaging and delivered well, even if that lesson is planned to some degree by an AI. And maybe technology like Dewey Learn can help me get better at kind of recognizing
Yep.
when a kid needs intervention or
Yep.
whether my own skills need to be sharpened.
Yep.
um, yeah, how do you respond to that as my own little diatribe?
Completely 100% agree. I think, if I were starting my career as a teacher, I would be over the moon that I was at the dawn of the reinvention of one of the most profound institutions in human history that is quite recalcitrant, but is now being forced to rethink and change. And I could, as a young teacher, have an impact that I never thought possible. I do see the flip side of that. I spend a lot of time talking to schools, universities, educators, and I think you cannot underestimate the fear and the conservatism in traditional educational institutions. And so, you know, I think my biggest hope is with the new generation, folks who are coming into the teaching profession now will have a different expectation of what that looks like and what tools they have available to them. And they will push for innovation. I think teaching and learning are going to be more important parts of our labor economy. So if you think about it, what is a foundation model company actually doing? They're teaching a model to deliver value and align with human goals. Every foundation company, every frontier AI company is hiring people with, if you look at the skill sets, it's a teacher they're hiring. They're hiring educators. They're hiring learning specialists. And I think the field of education is going to broaden in scope and actually be a much larger part of the global labor economy over the next decade than it ever was before. But a lot of that learning may not be humans. It might be humans teaching machines to be better at interacting with humans. And so I am very hopeful, but I think it's a battle, right? It's going to take persistent effort.
Yeah. No, I can completely relate to that. And it makes me think about some of the other stories I've seen in The Economist is that, yes, all of these models are going to be super capable, but we're not taking into account the adoption rate of these institutions. And in my experience, when I was a teacher, I would, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, one of my remits was to use technology and explore technology that could enhance education. And then once I'd found something that I thought was effective, roll it out across the faculty and educate other teachers and say, you should try using this new technology. It was almost impossible. It was so hard
Not
to,
because of the technology.
no, but me, just some young punk straight out of university who's trying to tell this teacher who's done the job for 2 decades, hey, have you tried using this technology? It's really great. They're like, don't try and tell me how to do my job. Thank you very much, Sonny Jim. And I could see
Bobby,
that.
to give you a sense of how old I am, the school that I worked at, which was my alma mater in New York City, my first job out of college, I created their first EdTech program there. And my team and I were the first to wire the building to this thing called the internet. And, you should have seen the reactions of the teachers in the school. They were like, what are you guys doing? Why? How do we kill it? That was the reaction.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, and even thinking about it now, you know what? I mean, I went to school in 1995 and we had a computer science lab. It's called a computer science lab. There was just a room full of computers. And when I was a teacher 10 years ago, and, still it was rooms full of computers and still kids were doing everything by hand on, when you think about it, it's so obvious that eventually that type of way of doing work. I mean, obviously it has its benefits, and I'm not saying that we should do away with pen and paper. Clearly, it's everything's online, everything's digital.
I mean,
Clearly, there's some sort of mismatch.
I taught history. My first year teaching was teaching history, 9th grade history. So the first year of high school. So it was a course I had taken 8 years prior, right? Or less than that, I guess, whatever. Yeah, 8 years, right? So I'd gone through high school, college. I was coming back to teach the course I took as a high school freshman. And the textbook was the exact same textbook that I had studied from. And it was published in 1968. Students were learning about the world from a single information source that was from 1968. And I didn't remember
Crazy.
anything from that course, which tells you the value of a history education, textbook bound history education. I was rereading the book that I had learned from in 1985 from 1968, and I was teaching the same things to these students.
I had a pediatrician on the podcast, and you sort of talk about Moore's law. Well, there's a certain Moore's law that applies to health literature, and he was saying that they say it's like every 2 years or every 18 months, the amount of information to do with the doubles, the information coming out of the literature. And so, he's like, even during your doctor training, your healthcare training at university, things are going out of date immediately. And he was saying, that's one of the benefits of ChatGPT is because you don't need to know everything as a doctor. You just need to have the critical thinking skills.
That's right.
You can go to ChatGPT and get actual up-to-date information about whatever's happening in the world. But, the inability and it speaks across the board here. It speaks to the need, as you say, to know how to learn, to know how to investigate, to have critical thinking skills, and then use these tools to amplify that or augment that, I think is sort of obvious here. The other point I wanted to bring up or make based on what you're saying is, so because of this institutional lag, I suppose, of adoption, I guess it is going to be with those newly qualified teachers. And back to your point, I think it is a really exciting time for a teacher to be entering the profession because they have the opportunity to completely be the vanguards of this kind of new way of teaching, and that's just so exciting because it's not going to be the old guard. A lot of, speaking from experience, the people that are kind of 5 years from retirement are like, well, I don't want to learn a new way. So it's going to be if you're 20 something going into teaching now, I mean, what a great time to start experimenting with how to teach your kids.
Totally.
Right. Well, that was a little extra. Do you still have time to do the fun part of the podcast?
Let's do your question. So ask me the first one again.
All right. General tip.
General tip. Pay for your AI.
Okay, I love that. Go on. I mean, so does Sam Altman and
Yeah, so whether it's Claude or it's ChatGPT or Google Gemini, pay for it. And there's three real reasons I always tell people this, because everyone's like, why should we pay for this? It's another service. I pay for so many things and I can get it for free. So number one, for anyone who has the paid versions are light years better than the free versions in every respect. Number two, you have more safety, privacy, security assurances in the paid version. But the real reason I say that is what we learned from the social media revolution was that if you don't pay for something, you are the product. And the only way they're giving this to you for free is because they're extracting all the information from you and selling it to their real customer, who are the corporates that thrive on that information. We are at a pivotal moment in the history of these foundation models where they are trying to figure out what their business model is. And I don't know if you've seen it's gone viral, the Claude, the Anthropic television commercials that they're going to air on the Super Bowl,
yeah,
which
explain it to our guests.
yeah, so
To our listeners, sorry.
OpenAI has now announced that ChatGPT is going to have advertising in it. And on one level, you're like, so what, right? Like there's going to be an ad and now I can use ChatGPT for free. And the Anthropic, which makes Claude, has committed to never having advertising. And they've launched a series of commercials that tell in a very poignant but snarky way what your experience looks like at ChatGPT with advertising. And I think that we look to these models as the arbiters of truth. And as soon as you integrate advertising into it, you have completely, violated the boundaries of church and state, in my view. And so I want to encourage these companies to see that the real business model, the real value is in convincing customers like us that it's worth paying for. And if you're the customer, you have leverage. If you're the product, you have no leverage. And so I tell people, just cancel your Disney Plus, cancel your Netflix, and pay for your ChatGPT. That's the first thing I would tell people to do.
All right, good tip. Good tip. I like it. All right. Well, before we move on from that, what do they get? Let's talk in practical terms. What do you get when you pay for one of these models,
Well,
other than leverage? What do
yeah,
I?
so you get far more tokens, so you get more interaction before it says, sorry, you're out of tokens, you don't get to talk to me for another 12 hours, right? And if you're coding or you're doing any kind of problem solving, the last thing you want is to get interrupted in the middle of that. And so you get more usage, you get more features, the ability to plug it into other applications, access to coding environments, and just a lot more power. The quality of the result, you generally can use more sophisticated models, and you get safety and security and privacy assurances that you don't get from the free model.
Right, you can turn off the sharing your data with the owner, which I guess is part of your leverage that you're describing. I'll also add to that as more of a kind of a call to arms, as amplifying what you've already been saying. But these are going to be it's going to be through some sort of large language model that we will be interacting with our devices in the future, and it will serve everybody to get better at interacting with an AI
Yeah,
and
for
learning
sure.
how they work. And the more you can integrate it with all of your various different workspaces, the better. The sooner the
Yep.
better, really, to do that. You're at a
Yep.
disadvantage if you're not learning that. That said, if anyone has gotten to this part of the podcast and isn't already subscribing to one or another, then I will be amazed. But leave a comment in the comments if you are not subscribing.
Yeah. Or if you're subscribing, which one are you subscribing to and why? It would be interesting to know too.
You need to do my job. All right. So Luyen, next one is your own personal superpower or a hack or some sort of interesting, quirky way that you can use one of these tools that other people might not have thought of.
Yeah. I am a big believer that context is key, that the quality of the results you get back from your AI increase exponentially with how much it knows about you. And so, I don't know how many of your listeners do this, but I'm very intentional about what I put into the system prompt of my AIs. So I will go into the preferences setting and I will be really thoughtful about how I cue it. The banal, like don't use M dashes to the more, sophisticated. Don't be sycophantic. Be a skeptic. Challenge everything that I say. Don't compliment without a really good reason, those sorts of things. And I also tell it a lot about myself. And I always turn on memory because I want it to learn as much as it can about who I am. And in the system prompt, I say, refer to your memory first. Make sure you're using your memory about me before you answer anything.
Okay, I'm going to just make that super clear to our listeners. So also we're talking about paid features here. Memory, I'm pretty sure, is only
Yeah.
available if it's a paid feature. But to our listeners, you've talked about two things there. One is that in settings, there is a area where you can, the text box where you can give your AI a kind of like a base level of knowledge, telling it, how do I want to be talked to? Here are the key things that you need to know in every interaction with me. And, like, don't use M dashes. The other part of it is memory, where it stores everything from every conversation. And that is a super powerful way to have a whole bunch of context. So it will say, oh, Bobby, I know you've got a dog. And so you should think about that when you're planning this trip that you've asked me for details about. I have a question for you, though, because firstly, which is your chatbot of choice? What is your main? Which one do you tend
It
to
changes
use?
all the time. I actually just downgraded my ChatGPT Pro account to Plus and upgraded my Claude to Ultra. So Claude is kind of my tool of choice right now. I use both a lot, and I like Google Gemini a lot too for certain things.
We're in the same boat. I happen to have just downgraded. ChatGPT has become my third now, and I've got Gemini in the
Yeah,
middle, and Claude is at the
interesting.
top. But one thing I always noticed was that when I was doing system prompts, I haven't gone back to it for a long time, but it wasn't very good at kind of.
Hmm.
I don't know if it wasn't reading them. I'm wondering, when you ask it not to do M dashes, is it
Yeah,
effective? Is
yeah.
it
For me, it is.
okay? That's great.
But the other thing, just related to just in a little extension of that, and this is particularly useful for those who are doing like vibe coding. The thing to remember is memory and context are very precious in an LLM interaction. Even with like a lot of context window, right? Which is the context window, so meaning the amount that your LLM can store in its memory when it interacts with you has grown tremendously. Knowing it's the same thing as Dewey Learn. Knowing what's important in that context window is hard without guidance. And
Can you define context window?
yeah, so the context window is anything that your large language model adds to your prompt based on its memory, system prompting, documents that you upload. It's awareness of the larger context. And that is literally, think of it as a text document, right? Context windows have a certain like size limit in terms of literally the number of characters in that context. And that has increased. It used to be very, very small. If you had three prompts, conversations with ChatGPT, it would forget what you did in the first one immediately. That context window has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. But with that getting bigger, the same problem that I mentioned with Dewey Learn starts to take place. It doesn't know what feature is important in that context window. So one of the tricks I use is particularly with coding is I actually manage the important stuff in an external document. So I will tell Claude every time we get to a major stopping point, a major milestone in this coding, I want you to update a changelog that explains how we arrived at where we arrived at and what we learned, what the lessons are that we learned. And then what I tell Claude to do is every time I fire up a new session, check that changelog. And that results in radically better outcomes.
Please check the change. So you start a new conversation every time you do a coding session, and just make sure there's an updated change log. That's
Yeah.
very handy.
It has to read that. It has to read that document. So they actually now Claude has kind of built that in. So there's a claude.md file when you code. It's a markdown file, and it's like the system prompt, but you have to go further than that. I say build an additional file. I call it lessons, or I call it changelog, like lessons.md. Use your intelligence to distill what are the core lessons you learned from the last 72 interactions, documented in this document. And every time I start you up, read that again. And that surfaces that to the top of its attentional window.
That's really great. It's really great. That's a really useful term as well. Context window. It's something that I hadn't fully understood the definition of that, but that I knew that, these long chats can start going a bit loopy the longer they get. And I understood it to be that it's reading everything in the chat before and your prompt, but I hadn't realized it was also documents that you upload as well. And that helps me understand why NotebookLM and Gemini, with these massive context windows, are so great at uploading corpuses of text that you need answers about. But when I upload, say, 10 interview transcripts to ChatGPT, it can only give me answers around about 3 of them,
That's right.
and it's the
You've
context window.
exceeded the context window.
Right.
Right. And that's the idea of RAG. I mean, that's very much what we're doing with Dewey Learn. Is the way around that is say, take these these podcasts one at a time and extract the things that are really important and ask me if these are the right things. And let's create a smaller document that just consists of the important stuff. And now you've got a memory nugget that is a distilled essence. That's the really important stuff across all of those pieces of content.
Be aware of context windows and figure out how to hack it.
Yeah,
Work around it. Okay, great. All right, that was a very good practical tip. This is some fantastic practical use cases we're getting out of you here. All right, finally, your fun or unexpected use case.
Oh God, so many.
Great. Well, look, just fire at will.
So, one of them is, you mentioned NotebookLM. So, I love NotebookLM, but not for what most people love it for, not for creating a podcast. I use it to create the infographic that helps me understand what's going on. And so if I have a complex research paper, something I'm trying to understand or whatever, I'll feed that into NotebookLM and I'll say, give me an infographic or give me a 5-page deck that explains this in the crispest terms possible. And it has been a huge benefit to my ability to learn stuff. I don't even have time for the podcast anymore, let alone reading the document. But if you build the infographic for me, I'm a visual learner. Boom. Like total hack, total.
That's amazing. From a Harvard educated person, Harvard
Quite
alumni
embarrassing, actually.
and Columbia alumni. You heard it here. Those infographics. I love those infographics. I did an episode on the infographics alone, and I just mind completely blown. My wife's a bit of an AI skeptic, but I started making infographics for various things to do with our childcare, and her words in the end. I said, I can also turn this into a spreadsheet. I think it was like we were doing like a trip to England. I turned it into an infographic, like the plan. And I said, I can also do this as a spreadsheet if you want. And she said, no, Bobby, we're infographic people now.
I love it. I love it. That's
I said,
awesome.
yes, we are infographic people now. I love it. Love that though. I mean, a big complicated computer science paper. I'm going to have to try and chuck one of those into NotebookLM and see if I can get an infographic that helps me level up my understanding of all of these complex topics.
I have been blown away by that. And the last thing I would just say, the other one is, if you take Dewey Learn and everything I told you about it, I've been taking old videos of my kids where there's one where I do a math problem with my son when he was like 3.5 years old, 4 years old. He's now 23 years old. He works for my company. But I just found it, like, think about how many billions of hours of video parents have of their kids up on the web. I've been feeding those into Dewey Learn one by one and extracting incredible insights about my kids and about me as a parent and about what the real meaning of our exchanges are, that have had a profound impact on my perspective on my relationship with my kids. And I share it with them and they're like, Dad, you never understood this. This is Dewey Learn got this. You never understood it. And I just think it makes me realize we've documented all of our lives digitally and we've never actually extracted the real latent value in that. And with something like Dewey Learn, we have an opportunity to finally do that. And that has been like a big mind blower for me.
Okay, so a bit of a maybe also another product on your
Yeah.
hands there.
Yeah.
That's nice. Is that can we end this podcast with a heartwarming, profound moment? Are you able to share any of those
Yeah.
insights that it gave you,
Yeah,
or is
so
it
I
too
will
intimate?
actually so there's a video of, my son, shout out Bailey, and, I was such a bad dad. He would sit down to eat his little chicken nuggets, and I would immediately go into, "All right, Bailey, we're gonna do a Star Wars math problem." There are 2 Death Stars, and each Death Star has 5 Star Cruisers in it, right? And, like, how many Star Cruisers are there? And, you know, God bless this kid. He was always game for these things. Like, there's 10 and here's why. And, I fed it the first time I fed this, literally, it's a 4-minute video. I put it into Dewey Learn almost as a lark. And I said, tell me something I don't know about this, that I might not know about this learner. And it said, because in the video he starts to get a little confused and get his explanation gets convoluted about something, and it says at these moments in the video the student, the learner's hands go up and he gets agitated, his voice volume goes up by 12%, the speed of his phrasing increases by 35%, and then he expresses frustration. But rather than indicating that he is frustrated because he doesn't know something, he gets the right answer 100% of the time right after that. And it explained that what he's actually doing is not expressing frustration or a lack of understanding. He is emotionally priming himself to get the energy to then do the mental math to get the answer, which is actually classic behavior of people with particular cognitive processes. Like, it's a very classic ADHD behavior. And I got frustrated as a parent because I didn't understand why he was getting frustrated. And it was only after seeing Dewey Learn's analysis of it, I realized that I shouldn't have been frustrated, that this was the way that he was getting to the right answer. And when I showed it to my son, he was like, exactly. Like, yes. Why
Yeah.
didn't you understand this? And it was a very poignant moment because on the one hand, it was like this amazing epiphany. And on the other hand, I'm like, God, if I had had Dewey Learn 20 years ago, I would have actually parented him differently.
Right. It could have helped you see your child more clearly.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that's lovely. That's a really lovely, practical. I think that's a great place to wrap up. So, sums everything that was spoken about up in a very kind of heartwarming and clear way with a visual reference. So, thank you, Luyen. Really, really great having you on the show. And yeah, I think we'll have in the show notes any links to Dewey Learn and anything else that you'd like us to share. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you to you, and to our listeners and viewers. Thank you too. I'll see you next time on It's Not the End of the World, unless it really is the end of the world.